overall, if we compare in-sessional inset with pre-sessional induction, it may tell us something about the very differing requirements of these two cohorts, and therefore the differing development needs of teachers in these roles. So what we've got here are some items from a pre-sessional induction, and I've highlighted in green the things which overlap with the in-sessional inset. But one of the things I find myself thinking about now is that the Liverpool in-sessional inset framework emerged and was situated in a very particular context. It was the pandemic. We were thrown into online delivery. We were working from home. There were changes in the team, the teaching team. There were changes in the in-sessional management. And there were new areas of provision and increased provision. And all of this necessitated something more than a few team meetings. There was really an internal impetus to come together for something more substantial in terms of teacher development, to forge and to maintain strong supportive links across the team, to combine mutual support and peer review as a kind of internal QA of our practice, and to establish a balance between greater consistency, but also exploring new approaches to our practice. So it was very much a healthy exchange of ideas, experiments, experiences, emotion, advice, debate. And I question how much of its success is determined by the particular context in which it emerged. Can it be adapted and used in other contexts? And this is something perhaps that we can think about today. So for now, that's the end of part one, and I'm happy to deal with any questions before we move on. Okay, so the next 20 or so slides are taken directly from the inset session that we did on developing effective in-sessional materials. And this was easily a 2-hour session. So before your hearts sink, the intention is not to go through it all in great detail, but to summarize the content, highlight some key points, and link this session to other inset sessions and the wider in-sessional matters. So think of these slides as appendices. You may want to read about them in more detail if you're interested afterwards. But really, I'm just going to sort of talk through what each of them are without going into too much details. So we looked at different approaches and examples of materials. We did develop a principled framework for materials. We thought about our minimum standards, some do's and don'ts, and then further support and resource materials for materials development. So with the approaches and examples, we all basically piled in with suggestions, and the question of quality was very much a part of the process of materials production. So these were the different ways that people suggested you might approach developing effective in-sessional materials. That might be things from looking at, module handbooks, going to lectures, talking to tutors, okay? Reading lists, assessment briefs, doing a needs analysis. So these are all suggestions for ways of getting started with figuring out what materials you're going to need to develop. I am going to zip through these, apologies, but the slides will be available afterwards. And then we also thought about this question of how do we evaluate in-sessional materials? What's the basis on which we would do that? And we thought about skills, criteria, how we would apply that to existing materials, that the materials must be valid, there must be some kind of interaction, and do the students do something in English, not just listen to us teachers telling them something. So what sort of activities are they doing? And these are all ways of measuring the effectiveness of our materials. And these were some of the suggestions that came from the team as well, that, we need to give them not too much, not too little, just enough. Some tasks, practice, make sure that the language and the skills are transferable so they're not too bound to one particular module. It's achievable. And this point about don't teach content, we had a big discussion about this and what we mean by content. I think we meant the content of the discipline, but we use the content as a vehicle, as a carrier content. But we've recently been having more debates about actually, well, what about EAP content? We have our own content. So this is something that we are debating at the moment in terms of, what do we mean by content and our content in comparison to the departmental content. Okay. So these were some of the things questions we could ask ourselves about how we could evaluate those materials. So we looked at some different examples of discipline-specific and general academic English materials, and we assessed them on that basis. And we talked about how we could improve them and what we thought the materials should be doing. And this is a framework for EAP materials that was developed by one of the team. And we then adapted that more specifically for in-sessional. Okay, and thought, are there things we need to add or change here? And so on this slide, we have what we added at the end, that for in-sessional materials, they should be relevant to the programme of study, aligned with the course content, and focused on teaching language and skills rather than their course content. Work and thought about how we could use that to evaluate our materials. I know that's being revised and updated, so we can come back to that, but we extracted these things in terms of syllabus and programme development, the different academic contexts and academic discourse, and that we could see whether we were fulfilling the criteria here. Okay, I'm going to zip ahead. We looked at the BARLEAP course design criteria as well, whether we were doing each of these things. And then from that, we tried to agree some minimum standards that we would aim to hit with all our materials on in-sessional. And a really important one is that it's worth the time spent in a student's schedule, that they are very busy, and we want to make sure that what we're offering them is something that is worth the time they're going to give up to come to an in-sessional class, but also that they are ideally able to be used by another teacher, although they may be quite individual to a particular teacher. That it's all recorded clearly, that we've got schemes and records of work, and also that we evaluate our materials as we go along. We looked back at our BARLEAP accreditation report, and we thought, okay, that's what they said in 2016. Does that still stand? Are we still achieving this? And we focused very much on trying to make sure that the materials were focused and timely, that they're doing the right thing at the right time for the students' deadlines. And this again connects with syllabus design, but that we've got information from handbooks, lecture content, talking to departments, analysing assessment criteria, and helping students to ask the right questions. So again, we've got overlap with materials, syllabus, and liaison. It's really hard to separate them, and that's why we can think of these three things as core pillars for in-sessional. We might look at previous materials, but also critically evaluate them. And there's quite a lot of reaching out and sharing and asking. And I think there's an understanding amongst the team that we acknowledge the contribution of our fellow tutors. I've got content here in inverted commas, so I'm not going to go in and teach engineering, but I might use an engineering text. And also a word of caution that we don't necessarily have to do everything that the subject tutor says. They might have quite different ideas about what students need to what we feel they need, or the students themselves. So it's not a given that just because somebody in Department X says they need to do this, that's necessarily what you have to do. We wouldn't cross over and use materials from pre-sessional or from one discipline to another, or if you were thinking of doing it, that you would consult and check that that would be appropriate. That we wouldn't cross over and use general materials for discipline-specific classes and vice versa. That we don't do things that might waste a student's time, and that we present them in an academic format, just as they would on their programmes. So far more do's than don'ts. And in terms of support and resources, always the possibility to ask for advice and get feedback from people on the team. Incredibly generous team who make their materials available and share ideas and give people feedback. Also technical support, some sort of team teaching. Again, this is all during a period of being online. So we had a virtual staff room. We could look at previous materials, but also getting feedback from students and the module tutors, and more collaboration in that way. And sort of regular meetings where we can share and give each other feedback on our materials. Try and do from that was to take it further with a broader review of materials and actually audit the materials that we've got and think about stuff that we don't need anymore or that isn't in keeping with the minimum standards that we've agreed. We haven't done that completely yet. It's an ongoing thing. But again, another tool that we can use is something like the CEM model with a balanced scorecard. Look at our practice and our materials in terms of how contextualized, how embedded we are, and how well mapped our materials are. So some key questions that we can ask ourselves from that balanced scorecard to do with academic discourse and how embedded we are, or that we're very contextualized. We could do more with embedding. And I think we're also very, very closely mapped in our discipline specific. But this is looking just at EAP staff, at the tutors themselves. So that's a sort of a whistle-stop tour of that. But more broadly, I think we can say that with the materials, effective ISE provision is really tied in with liaison being integrated. It works best when we have that collaboration with departments. And again, that's something where we're not there yet. We're hoping to get more embedded. And think about this comment, or the title from Ding and Bruce's book about operating on the edge of academia, EAP tutors. And I think there is truth in that, but hopefully we are getting a bit closer. And I'm just going to sort of conclude with a comment from a colleague, given their consent for me to use this comment, who, when they moved onto in-sessional, said, now I feel like I work at a university. And it made me question, where did they feel they'd been working before? But also, what is it about in-sessional that made that person feel that way? Does it enable that feeling because of the liaison, working with departments, etc.? Just like to also roll the credits on the in-sessional team, because that whole materials development session was co-built with them. The inset framework was co-built with them. So to acknowledge that this is very much a team effort of everyone working together on this. And we've gone from that opening image of one penguin taking a plunge while the others are sort of watching, to a bunch of very happy penguins plunging into uncharted waters together. So I think those are some references. And just to say thank you